She was 18 and newly orphaned, with no family to speak of, and no expectation of kindness, just a carpet-bag of mended linen, a small tin of pins that had been her grandmother's, and 4 shillings and sixpence tied into the corner of a handkerchief. And with that little sum she took the coach out to East Barrow, where a fire-scarred manor called Hallowfield was hiring a girl for the linens and the coal scuttles at £9 a year. But what nobody told her, and what nobody in that house intended anyone to learn, was that behind the plaster and the newly laid brick of the sealed east wing there was a room the family had every reason to bury. Settle in with a cup of something warm, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. And stay close, because what Lucy Brooks carried into that house was smaller than a prayer book, and what she carried out of it changed the shape of 3 lives. Lucy Brooks had been born in the parish of Little Ashcombe in the spring of 1849, the only child of a wheelwright named Thomas Brooks and a laundress named Anne, and for the first 11 years of her life she had known the particular contentment of a poor but well-run cottage, a scrubbed deal table, a rag rug her mother had braided out of the family's outgrown aprons, and the smell of hot iron and starch coming from the copper in the yard on a Monday. Her father died first, of a lung condition made worse by the sawdust of his trade, and her mother followed 3 winters later of a fever that swept the low houses along the beck. And Lucy, at 14, was sent to live with her mother's aunt, a woman she had scarcely met, in a village called Farrowbridge, some 8 miles distant. The aunt, a Mrs. Marjorie Wren, was a widow of nearly 70 who kept house alone in a 2-room cottage behind the church, and took in fine sewing for the vicar's wife and for 2 or 3 of the neighboring farmers' daughters. And it was in that cottage that Lucy learned the trade of a household, how to lay a fire so it drew clean, how to turn a collar so the wear did not show, how to render mutton fat for candles, how to read a pound of flour by the weight of it in the palm, and how to hold her tongue when a woman above her station spoke foolishly. Marjorie Wren was not a warm woman in the ordinary meaning of the word, but she was a steady one, and she took Lucy's measure in the first week and decided the girl was capable, and from that decision came 4 years of patient teaching that shaped Lucy more than anyone else had ever done or ever would. She taught her to darn so the mend became part of the cloth, to keep a still-room of dried thyme and comfrey and horehound, to write a plain hand for household accounts, and above all to notice the loose stone in a floor, the tell of damp behind a bit of wallpaper, the way a hinge on a good door sits deeper than a hinge on a cheap one. And Lucy, who had always been quiet and watchful, found in the old woman's steady expectation a shape she could grow into. Marjorie Wren died in the January of Lucy's 18th year, sitting upright in her chair by the fire with a piece of pale gray wool in her lap and her needle still threaded, and Lucy laid her out herself and paid the sexton 4 shillings for the grave and walked back from the churchyard through a thaw that ran black water down every lane. The cottage was not Lucy's. It had been held on a life tenancy from the glebe, and within a fortnight the vicar's man came round with a courteous letter and a date, and Lucy folded her aunt's chemises and her own 2 dresses into the carpet-bag and closed the door on the last home she had. What she carried with her out of that cottage, besides the linen and the tin of pins and the coins in the handkerchief, was one thing more, and it was the thing she guarded above every other, and that was a small silver thimble no larger than the tip of her thumb, worn thin at the crown from 40 years of use, with the initials M.W. scratched inside the rim in a hand that had never learned to write except in scratches, because Marjorie had learned her letters late and imperfectly. The thimble had sat on the old woman's 3rd finger every day Lucy had known her, and on the last morning, before Lucy walked to the coach, she had slipped it into the small inner pocket of her bodice where she kept her mother's wedding ring, and she had felt, in that private weight against her ribs, the only inheritance she believed she would ever have. She had answered the advertisement in the county paper because the wage was fair and the house was far enough that no one there would know her, and because the notice, printed in careful small type, said only that a healthy young woman of good character was wanted for general service at Hallowfield near East Barrow, and that a fire the previous autumn had reduced the establishment, and that the successful applicant would be required to accept simplified duties in the remaining part of the house. Lucy had read the notice twice, had counted her coins, had written back in the plain hand her aunt had taught her, and had received 4 days later, an acceptance signed in a spidery script by a Mrs. Ada Halloway, housekeeper, along with instructions to present herself at the tradesman's entrance on the afternoon of the 14th. She had spent one of her 4 shillings on the coach fare and another 6pence on bread and cheese for the journey, and she had left Faro Bridge on a grey morning that smelled of coal smoke and wet hedges, and she had not looked back at the church tower behind her, because Marjorie Wren had once said that a person walking toward work should keep her eyes on the road. The letter from the vicar's man had come on a Tuesday, 4 days after Marjorie Wren's burial, and it had been slipped under the door in an envelope of good paper that had cost more than the message inside deserved. Lucy had found it when she came in from beating the hearthrug against the low wall behind the cottage, and she had set it on the deal table and washed her hands before she opened it because Marjorie had taught her that letters were read with clean fingers. The vicar's man wrote in a round, clerkly hand that the Glebe cottage had been held on a life tenancy by the late Mrs. Wren, that the tenancy had expired with her, that the parish thanked Lucy for her attention to the deceased, and that the cottage would be required for a new tenant by the last day of the month. He signed himself yours faithfully, and he had added, beneath his name, that if Lucy required assistance in the removal of any personal effects, she was to apply at the vestry between the hours of 10 and 12. There was no anger in the letter and no cruelty in it, and that was, Lucy understood, the shape cruelty took in her part of the world. It wore a clean collar and a courteous phrase, and it arrived by hand on a Tuesday afternoon. She read the letter twice, folded it along its creases, and put it into the drawer of the dresser where Marjorie had kept the rent receipts, and then she made herself a cup of tea from the last of the leaves in the caddy and drank it standing at the window, because sitting down just then seemed a thing she could not afford to do. She had 11 days. She counted them on the calendar tacked to the inside of the pantry door, and she counted, too, the small store of things that were hers by right and not by tenancy. Her 2 dresses, her mother's ring, Marjorie's thimble, the tin of pins that had been her grandmother's, a comb, a Bible with the Brooks names written on the flyleaf in 3 different hands, and the 4 shillings and 6pence she had put by from the last piece of sewing Marjorie had finished before her hands went still. Everything else in the cottage, the deal table, the rag rug, the copper by the yard door, the shelf of still-room jars, the very needle and grey wool that had lain in Marjorie's lap, belonged, by the courteous logic of the letter, to the parish. Lucy did not argue. She wrote out, on the back of a used envelope, an inventory of what she would leave behind and what she would take, and she carried the inventory to the vestry on the Thursday and gave it to the vicar's man, who thanked her and said she was a sensible girl, and she thanked him in return and walked home, and she did not, on the way, allow herself to think of the deal table or the copper as things she had loved. She thought of them instead as tools she had been permitted to use for a while, and she gave them back in her mind, one by one, as she walked, so that when she came to the cottage door, they were already gone from her, and only the carpet-bag remained to be packed. On the last night, she scrubbed the flags of the kitchen floor and set the fire ready laid for the next tenant, because Marjorie had said that a person who left a place tidy was a person who could hold up her head in the lane, and Lucy meant, above all else, to hold up her head in the lane. The coach for East Barrow left from the yard of the Angel at Faro Bridge at 7:30 in the morning, and Lucy was there at 7, standing under the archway with her carpet-bag at her feet and her bonnet strings tied twice against the wind. The horses were a bay and a grey, both of them older than she was, and both of them patient in the cold, and the coachman, a thick-set man in a caped greatcoat, took her ticket without looking at her face and told her to climb up inside with the 2 other passengers, who were a corn factor in a snuff-colored coat and a woman in mourning going to her sister's confinement. The coach rocked out of the yard on the stroke of the half-hour, and Lucy watched Faro Bridge slide away past the small window, the church tower she had promised herself not to look at, the row of low houses along the beck, the smoke rising in thin grey ribbons from 100 narrow chimneys, and then the fields, wet and dark under a sky the color of pewter, and then a long stretch of hedgerow, where a solitary rook sat on a leaning post and watched the coach go by without moving its head, The road ran north and east through country Lucy did not know, past plowed acres and stubble fields, and the occasional gray cluster of a village around a squat stone church, and the coach stopped twice, once at a turnpike where the coachman paid 3 pence, and once at a wayside inn where the passengers were allowed 10 minutes to stretch their legs, and the corn factor bought a mug of ale, and the morning woman bought nothing, and Lucy took out her bread and cheese and ate it, standing beside the water trough, because she did not want to spend a farthing more than she had to. The wind rose in the afternoon and drove a thin, stinging rain against the glass, and the coach lamps were lit before 4, and Lucy felt the cold come up through the boards into the soles of her boots, and she did not complain, because Marjorie had said that a woman who complained on a journey arrived tired twice over. She occupied herself instead by naming the things she saw: a hawthorn hedge cut back for winter, a shepherd moving a flock across the road with a black dog low at the sheep's heels, a milestone whose figures had been eaten by weather, a chalk pit shining faintly white in the failing light, a house set back behind a line of leafless limes. By the time the coach came down the last hill toward East Barrow, the rain had thickened into a fine, penetrating mist, and the village lay below them in a hollow of the moor, small and gray, and lit here and there by the yellow squares of tallow lamps in cottage windows. And beyond the village, on the shoulder of a rise, Lucy could make out the long, dark shape of a great house, with one end of it strangely blunted and dark, as though a portion had been cut away and left unfinished against the sky. The coachman said, without turning, that would be Hallowfield, and that the young woman had best hurry along the lower lane before the light went altogether, and Lucy climbed down into the wet yard of the Barrow Arms with her carpet-bag in her hand, and thanked him and set her face to the road. The lower lane climbed out of East Barrow between dry stone walls slick with wet moss, and Lucy walked with her carpet-bag balanced against her hip and her free hand steadying her bonnet against the wind. And after half a mile the lane bent and Hallowfield stood plain before her. It was built of the local gray stone, 3 stories under a slate roof, with a central block of 7 bays and 2 shorter wings extending east and west. The west wing stood whole, its leaded windows lit here and there behind drawn curtains, but the east wing was a ruin, dressed in new brick. Lucy stopped in the lane and looked at it plainly, because there was no other honest way to look at it. The upper story of the east wing had gone. What remained of the walls to the height of the first floor had been capped with a rough course of tile, and every window along that side had been filled in with fresh red brick laid in a pale mortar that had not yet weathered to match the stone. The end wall, where the wing met the central block, had been closed off entirely, so that where there must once have been doorways and passages, there was now a flat, blind face of new brickwork rising almost to the eaves. It looked, Lucy thought, less like a repair than like a bandage tied over a wound that had not been examined. She went round to the tradesman's entrance at the back, following a gravel path that skirted a kitchen garden gone to seed, and rang the iron bell beside the door. A thin girl in a stuff dress opened to her, looked her over without speaking, and led her along a stone-flagged passage to the housekeeper's room. Mrs. Ada Halloway was a small woman of perhaps 60, in a black bombazine dress with a bunch of keys at her waist, and she rose from her account book, took Lucy's damp bonnet from her, and looked into her face with the careful, weighing attention of someone who had hired many young women and been disappointed by several. She asked 3 questions: whether Lucy could lay a fire, whether she could carry a full scuttle up 2 flights without spilling, and whether she was afraid of the dark, and Lucy answered each in 1 word. Mrs. Halloway nodded, gave her a candle in a tin holder, and took her to see the house. They walked through the west wing first. The rooms in use were fewer than Lucy expected. A dining room with a long mahogany table dulled by neglect, a small morning room where a fire had been kept, a library whose shelves held books greened at the spines by damp, and above stairs a corridor of bedchambers of which only 3 were dressed. The rest were shut, their doors' handles cold. In the central block, the great staircase rose in 2 flights of oak worn hollow at the middle of each tread, and above it a plaster ceiling had cracked in a long diagonal where the fire's heat, Mrs. Halloway said briefly, had reached before it was checked. The passage on the first floor that had once led into the east wing ended now in a wall of new plaster smooth and cold, with no door and no skirting to mark where an opening had been. Mrs. Halloway laid her hand flat against the plaster for an instant, as one lays a hand on a coffin lid, and then took it away and walked on. Lucy's own room was at the top of the servants' stair in the western attics, a narrow chamber under the slope of the roof with an iron bedstead, a rush chair, a deal washstand with a chipped basin, a small window looking north over the stable yard, and a nail in the door for her clothes. The floorboards were scrubbed but old, and one board near the window rocked under her weight when she stepped on it, and Lucy noted it as Marjorie had taught her to note such things and said nothing. She unpacked in 10 minutes. She laid the mended linen in the single drawer of the washstand, set the tin of pins beside it, put the Bible on the chair, and moved her mother's ring and Marjorie's silver thimble from the inner pocket of her traveling bodice to the inner pocket of the working dress she would put on in the morning. Then she blew out the candle and lay down in her clothes because the bedding smelled of mildew, and she was too tired to unfold clean sheets from her bag. The work of the house began at 5:30. Lucy carried coal from the yard bunker in a black scuttle whose handle had been mended with wire, laid fires in the morning room and the library and Mrs. Halloway's parlor, drew hot water for the 2 Miss Ashfords and for their brother Mr. Edmund Ashford, who kept the house, swept the front hall, and by 9 o'clock had been on her feet 3.5 hours. In the first fortnight she learned the ways of the reduced household. That Mr. Edmund Ashford, a man of 42 in a black coat, took breakfast alone at 8 and did not speak to servants except through Mrs. Halloway. That the Miss Ashfords, sisters of 30 and 33, took theirs in the morning room and spoke only to each other. That a solicitor named Mr. Prewitt came out from East Barrow every second Wednesday and shut himself in the library with Mr. Ashford, and that no one, on any day, walked in the corridor that ended at the plastered wall. Lucy learned by touching the walls as she went along the passages, in the ordinary act of dusting the wainscot, that the plastered end was not the true limit of the corridor. Beyond the new plaster, when she rapped it with a knuckle low down where nobody would notice, there was a hollow behind it, and then, further along, the ring of solid brick, and then hollow again. She counted the hollow places and made no mark. She thought of the loose board in her attic. She thought of the deeper set hinge of a good door. She said nothing to anyone at all. It was on a Saturday in the 3rd week, while carrying an empty scuttle down the back stairs, that Lucy noticed the small door under the scullery passage. It was set low in the wall, no higher than her waist, painted the same cream as the wainscot so as almost to vanish, and fastened with a plain iron hasp and a padlock so old that the shackle had rusted half through. Mrs. Halloway had told her the door led to a coal cellar no longer in use, since the coal was now delivered to the yard bunker, and Lucy had accepted the explanation without question at the time. But that Saturday, passing it with an empty scuttle in her hand and the house quiet around her because the Ashfords had driven into East Barrow for the afternoon, Lucy set the scuttle down and looked at the padlock properly. She saw that the hasp itself was screwed into old, softened wood, and that the screws had been drawn and replaced more than once, because the paint around them was chipped in a way that fresh painting had failed to hide. She fetched a screwdriver from the tool drawer in the pantry, worked the 4 screws out in less than 5 minutes, and lifted the hasp aside with the padlock still fastened uselessly to it. The door opened inward onto a short flight of brick steps going down into cold air that smelled of soot and old lime, and something faintly sweet, like paper long shut away. Lucy took her candle from the shelf where she had left it, lit it at the scullery lamp, and went down. The cellar at the bottom was small and low, with a brick floor and a barrel-vaulted ceiling, and at the far end, where a coal chute should have been, there was instead a doorway framed in old timber and filled with brickwork that did not match the rest. The brick was newer, laid in a pale mortar Lucy recognized at once as the same mortar she had seen on the outside of the sealed east wing. She set the candle in a niche, fetched a poker and a mason's chisel and a wooden mallet from the tool drawer above, and went back down. She worked slowly, tapping the chisel in at the mortar joints as she had seen a bricklayer do once in Farrowbridge, and after nearly an hour of patient work she had loosened enough bricks to lift them out one by one and stack them on the floor. When the opening was large enough to step through, Lucy took up the candle and passed through it. The room beyond was not a cellar. It was a small ground-floor chamber of the east wing, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a plastered ceiling still whole, and a shuttered window whose glass had cracked but not fallen. There was a desk of dark oak against one wall, a chair pushed back from it as though its occupant had risen a moment before, an iron-bound chest on the floor beside the desk, a bookshelf with perhaps 30 volumes, and on the desk a green glass shade over an oil lamp long since dry. The air was dry because the wing had been closed before the damp could enter, and everything in the room stood as it had been left. Lucy set her candle on the desk and looked. On the blotter lay a bundle of papers tied with faded red tape, and on top of the bundle lay a plain envelope addressed in a firm, old-fashioned hand to whoever finds this room. Beneath the envelope, when she moved it, she saw a smaller cloth bag drawn shut with a cord, and when she lifted the bag it was heavy in her palm with the unmistakable, particular weight of gold coin. Lucy sat down slowly in the chair that had been pushed back from the desk, set the bag on the blotter, and with cold fingers untied the red tape and opened the envelope first. The letter, once read, went into the inner pocket of her working dress with the ring and the thimble, and Lucy sat a while longer in the chair that had belonged to a Mr. Josiah Marchant, land agent of Hallowfield from 1798 to 1836, before she moved. Then she took up the bundle tied with red tape and read it through by the candle. Leases in his careful hand, receipted rents, a rough plan of the estate boundaries, and beneath these the older papers he had gathered as proof. A deed of settlement dated 1802, a codicil in a different ink, and 3 letters from a London solicitor that named plainly what had been done with the tenants' rents and the timber money in the years before the family took Hallowfield in hand. Lucy did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. She put the cloth bag of gold and the bundle of papers into the iron-bound chest, closed it, took the small key from a hook beside the desk, locked it, and put the key into her pocket beside the letter. Then she climbed back through the opening, rebuilt the bricks loosely into the gap with the mortar dust brushed back over the joints, replaced the hasp on the low door, and drove the 4 screws home. It was 4:15 when she carried the tools back to the pantry drawer, washed her hands at the scullery pump, and laid the fire in the morning room for the Ashfords' return. For a week, Lucy did nothing but her work. She carried coal, drew water, turned collars, and answered Mrs. Halloway with one word where one word would do. In the evenings, in her attic under the roof slope, she read the letter again and copied the names and dates onto the fly-leaf of her Bible in the plain hand Marjorie had taught her. On the second Wednesday of that period, when Mr. Prewitt the solicitor came from East Barrow, Lucy took his coat and his umbrella in the passage and looked at his face for the first time. He was perhaps 55, thin, with ink on the side of his left hand and a mourning band on his sleeve. On the following Saturday, when the Ashfords had driven again into East Barrow, Lucy walked the half-mile down the lane to the village and made 2 calls. She called first at the office of Mr. Henry Ainsley, a solicitor of Market Street, aged 48, who had known Josiah Marchant when Mr. Ainsley was a clerk. She laid the letter on his desk and 1 page of the bundle, and she asked him plainly whether such papers could be lodged for safekeeping without their being taken from her. Mr. Ainsley read for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he read the letter again, and then he told her that they could, and that he would draft a receipt in his own hand before she left. He gave her tea, a plain biscuit, and a receipt on his headed paper naming her as the depositor. Lucy left the greater part of the bundle with him and kept the letter, the deed of settlement, and the cloth bag of coin at Hallowfield in the iron-bound chest. Her second call was on Mrs. Susanna Brake, a widow of 62 who kept a stationer's shop in Barrow Lane and who had been housemaid at Hallowfield in the last 5 years of Josiah Marchant's tenure. Lucy bought a penny quire of paper and, over the counter, asked whether Mrs. Brake remembered a Mr. Marchant. Mrs. Brake set down her scissors, looked at Lucy properly, and said that she remembered him well and that he had been an honest man badly used. Lucy asked whether she would write down what she remembered, if it were needed, and Mrs. Brake said she would, and would sign it, and would bring another to witness. Through the following month, Lucy worked at both houses. The one above stairs where she carried coals, and the one below stairs where she pieced together, in her attic in the evenings, the frame of what the papers proved. Mr. Ainsley wrote twice in careful phrases, giving her advice on what he would need. A cartwright named John Trask, aged 34, whose father had carted timber off the Hallowfield land in 1834, brought a tally book to Mr. Ainsley's office at Lucy's asking and left it there without a word to anyone. The vicar of East Barrow, the Reverend Mr. Chettle, aged 51, went into the parish register on a Tuesday afternoon and copied out for Lucy the burials of 2 servants named in Josiah Marchant's letter and would not take payment for the copies. A widow named Mrs. Ellen Poole, aged 70, who had been laundress at Hallowfield in the old time, walked from her cottage at the edge of the moor and dictated her memory to Mrs. Brake, who wrote it down and made her mark for her. Lucy did the physical work herself, as Marjorie had taught her to do physical work, one thing at a time, and each thing well. She copied the deed of settlement in a fair hand on good paper so that the original need not be handled. She numbered the pages of the bundle. She wrote a plain summary, 3 sides long, of what the papers together showed, that in 1834 the elder Ashford, father of Mr. Edmund, had drawn against the estate on the security of timber not his to sell, that Josiah Marchant had refused to sign the schedule, that Marchant had been dismissed within the month, and that the fire in the east wing in the autumn of the previous year had taken the estate room, and with it, the ledgers the family had believed to be the only surviving record. She took her summary to Mr. Ainsley, who read it, corrected 2 words, and copied it onto his own paper under his own hand. On the last Wednesday of the month, Mr. Ainsley wrote to Mr. Prewitt in East Barrow and asked, formally and civilly, for a meeting on a matter concerning the Hallowfield estate, to be held at Mr. Ainsley's chambers on a day of Mr. Prewitt's choosing, and to be attended by Mr. Edmund Ashford if he so wished. The meeting was on a Thursday. Lucy did not go. She laid the morning fires as usual, drew water, and swept the hall, and at 11 she carried a scuttle of coal up to the library, where Mr. Ashford was reading a letter that had come by the first post. He did not look at her. She set the scuttle down, mended the fire, and went out. That afternoon, Mrs. Halloway came to the housekeeper's room, sent for Lucy, closed the door, and told her without preamble that she was to be moved from the attics to a chamber on the first floor of the west wing, and that her wages were to be raised to £14 a year. Mrs. Halloway did not explain. Lucy said thank you, curtsied, and went back to the scullery to finish the pans. By the end of the following month, the shape of things had settled. Mr. Edmund Ashford did not leave Hallowfield because Lucy had asked, through Mr. Ainsley, that he not be pressed further than the papers required. What was required was that certain rents wrongly taken since 1834 be made good to the tenants living and to the heirs of tenants deceased from the timber money that could still be traced, that Josiah Marchant's name be entered in the parish register with a correction to the note against his dismissal, and that the east wing be recorded in a document lodged at Mr. Ainsley's as containing the estate room and its papers, so that no future fire and no future plaster could hide what had been done. These things were done in the order named, and Lucy signed her name where Mr. Ainsley asked her to sign. In the village, she was known. Mrs. Brake and the stationers kept a chair by the counter for her on Saturdays and gave her tea from a brown pot without being asked. John Trask, the cartwright, when he passed her on the lane, touched his cap in the plain way men touch their caps to people they respect and not to people they fear. The Reverend Mr. Chettle asked her, in November, whether she would teach 2 of the village girls to read a plain hand, and Lucy said she would, on Sunday afternoons, in the vestry, from 2 till 4. 3 girls came the first Sunday, 5 came the second. By Christmas there were 7, and one of them was the thin, unnamed girl who had first admitted Lucy at the tradesman's entrance, and whose name, it turned out, was Bessie Marnock, aged 15. At Hallowfield her work changed by degrees. Mrs. Halloway, without ceremony, gave her the keys to the linen presses and the still-room in December, and by February Lucy had the ordering of the household stores from East Barrow and kept the book of them in the plain hand Marjorie had taught her. The Miss Ashfords, whose names were Miss Harriet and Miss Louisa, began to speak to her directly, first about small matters, a torn hem, a preference in tea, and then about larger ones. Mr. Edmund Ashford spoke to her once, on a March morning, to thank her, in 6 words, for a fire well laid, and she said, in 3, that it was her work, and went out. The east wing was opened in April. A mason from East Barrow, Mr. Peter Halcombe, aged 39, with 2 apprentices, took down the pale brick from the corridor end, and from the low cellar doorway, over a fortnight of careful days, and Lucy watched from the passage while he worked. The estate room was cleaned and aired, and Josiah Marchant's desk and chair and iron-bound chest were left in it, and the bookshelf with its 30 volumes was dusted, and the volumes returned to their places. The oil lamp with the green glass shade was refilled and lit once. On the evening the wing was reopened, and then covered again with a clean cloth. The room was not made into a museum. It was made into an estate room again, and Lucy kept the books in it on Tuesdays and Fridays, from 10 till 1, at a small deal table she had asked Mr. Halcombe to set up beside Marchant's desk, because she did not think it right to sit at the desk itself. On a Tuesday in June, with the window unshuttered and the cracked pane replaced by Mr. Halcombe at a cost of 2 shillings and 4pence, Lucy sat at the deal table with the household store-book open before her, and the estate ledger open beside it, and the afternoon sun came in low across the floor she had scrubbed herself. She was 19 years old now, and she wore the same working dress she had worn on the day she had lifted the 4 screws out of the low door, mended once at the elbow where she had rested it too long on Marchant's desk. On the deal table, laid out plainly on a square of cotton she had cut from an old pillowcase, were 3 things: her mother's wedding ring, Marjorie Wren's silver thimble with its scratched initials, and the small brass key to the iron-bound chest. She had put the 2 objects out that morning because she had wanted to look at them together, and now she looked at them, and did not move them, and did not put them away. The ring had come from a woman who had died before she had seen her daughter grown, and the thimble from a woman who had taken that daughter in and taught her every useful thing she knew, and the key had come from a man who had lived at Hallowfield for 38 years and had left, for whoever should find his room, a bag of coin and a bundle of papers, and a letter that had asked nothing of the finder except that the truth be set down. 3 strangers, in a manner of speaking, had put those things into her hands, and none of them had known her, and each of them had trusted her before knowing her, and it was that trust, more than the gold and more than the papers, that Lucy carried now. She thought of the vicar's man in Farrowbridge with his round clerkly hand and his courteous letter, and of the coach yard at the Angel in the grey morning, and of the dark shape of Hallowfield on the shoulder of the rise with its one end blunted and unfinished, and she thought that the people who had underestimated her had done so only because they had never watched her work. Mrs. Halloway rang the bell for tea below. Lucy closed the ledger, set the ring and thimble back into the inner pocket of her dress, hung the brass key on its hook, and went down. Lucy Brooks had been 18, and cast out, with 4 shillings and 6pence tied into the corner of a handkerchief and a silver thimble in her bodice, and she had spent 1 shilling on a coach fare into East Barrow to take up a place at £9 a year in a fire-scarred house that meant to keep its secrets. It was the best shilling she ever spent. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who believes, as Lucy did, that patient work and a careful eye can uncover what others have plastered over. And before you go, sit with this a while. What has life placed in your hands, small and unremarkable, that might yet be the beginning of everything you build?